As we all get settled in, I have a question for everybody, and you don't always have to say anything, but I'm trying to figure out when the concept of America being a melting pot was taught in schools and shifted into the America is a salad. So if anybody remembers being taught melting pot or salad, could you let us know? Because I'm trying to figure out when that distinction happened. I mean, we were talking about it earlier. I am 34 years old. I've told that to the internet now. And I was taught both of them. So I think I was on the cusp of it. Never heard of a salad. Okay.
Yeah, I think the
Interesting.
salad's pretty new, Mary. I think it's about when we were in school,
Yeah.
sort of the end of our schooling.
Because I know we'll talk about this in a little bit. It was just a different way to explain cultural identity in the United States. But I was wondering when that shift happened and anybody knew. Does anybody remember being told that it was a melting pot distinctly? Like that's just something that we learned? Never heard of a salad. Nobody's old in this room. Don't worry.
All right, I think we'll get started because we have a lot to cover. This is a pretty broad topic. Good evening, everyone. To begin, we would like to acknowledge that the history of our site does not start with the Europeans. The town of Ridgefield exists on the ancestral homelands of the Ramapo, Munsee Lenape, and Wishquaiskeq people. They were the original stewards of this land on which Keeler Tavern Museum and History Center stands today. And we thank them for their strength and their resilience in stewarding this land, and we hope to continue their legacy of protecting this site and its history. Welcome to Taproom Tastings, a virtual conversation about historic trends in food, drink, and culture. I am Catherine Prescott, Chief Curator at the Keeler Tavern Museum and History Center in Ridgefield, Connecticut, coming to you live from the taproom of the old Keeler Tavern. And my co-host is Mary Saltis Ottamanelli, Executive Director at the Hendrick I Lott House in Brooklyn, New York. And we'd love to hear from you as well throughout the program. As always, we welcome comments and questions in the chat at any time. So feel free to put questions and comments in the chat, and we'll try and address them right there. So tonight, we are really just going to scratch the surface of a topic that has been talked about in, I want to say, pretty much every single one of our programs, if not directly, indirectly, and that is the use of food in propaganda and politics. Food and drink are essential to life. We all need to eat. And so as we've explored in some of our previous programs, food is also very much connected to identity, right? Personal, cultural, regional, and as we'll talk about today, national identity. So food items themselves are not inherently political, but food production, food access, consumption are tied into politics and policies. And so issues surrounding food and access to food and the production of food are often indicative of other broader issues in social and economic spheres, as we'll find out. And one thing I always think about is like, today we use the cost of milk or the cost of eggs as sort of a shorthand to talk about how the wider economy is doing. And since ancient times, protests and riots related to food and food access have underscored larger political, social, economic issues, and have either preceded or been part of larger social upheavals. I think the food related kind of upheaval that a lot of people think of first is the French Revolution and Marie Antoinette's supposedly telling the women of France, let them eat cake when they complained they couldn't buy bread. It's now been shown that she did not say that, but the point still stands that food is inherently involved in a lot of the upheaval that happened throughout history. So we often, like I said, we often see food associated with protests and riots that happen oftentimes around bread, especially in European cultures where wheat is the main food source. For example, in Boston in the early 1700s, there were bread riots from 1710 to 1713. Boston is not a great place to grow wheat, being that it is mostly brackish water. So the city had to bring in grain from the surrounding area and from abroad. But it was a common practice for local grain merchants to hoard grain, which drove up the price, and then they would sell that grain to the more lucrative foreign markets. So eventually, in 1710, the people of Boston got fed up with this and the fact that they could not buy bread. And there was a large riot that I think included about 200 people, and it destroyed some grain merchants' boats and ships and things like that, so that they could have access to that grain rather than it being sold off. And of course, one of the things that's most pertinent to the Keeler Tavern here is the food relations to the American Revolution, right? We often talk about the causes of the American Revolution, right? And a lot of them also revolve around food, right? We have a lot of the taxes that the colonists were, revolting against, were related to access to food and drink and the cost of foods. Things like the Sugar Act that regulated the price of sugar and molasses, and therefore rum. And you have the Tea Act, which was not so much the cost of the tea, but establishing a monopoly for the East India Company. And you also, one of the ones that I didn't think of right away, but as I was researching this, it was pointed out in my readings that the Quartering Act, which required not only housing British soldiers in your home, but feeding them. And when you are a subsistence farmer, where any surplus food you've got is one of the limited ways most people could make money, by selling surplus food, but now you have to give it to this guy who's living in your house. I can see why that would be frustrating. And so when
there's a big connection of Boston to food and protests. Yeah. There's a very common line over the next 250, 300.
Yeah, certainly. And so that's when you start getting things like boycotts of food, right? And food products that are coming from Britain. And you get, throughout the revolution, there are riots surrounding food, protesting high prices or food scarcity, protesting price gouging. So these are not only people who are protesting and rioting against British control, but also against American merchants and shop owners who are price gouging or hoarding food that is becoming scarce, and things like that. And one of the things is that a good size number of these riots that I was looking at were either led by or had a large number of women participating in them. And the 18th century obviously is a period of time when women are not allowed to, directly influence policy. They're not involved in policy making or governance of any kind, but boycotting goods and also just protests. You get enough women together, people are going to listen anyway. So a lot of them are led by, or the groups are made up by a lot of women. So this was their way of participating politically. Um, and one of the things that we often hear about, things like the Boston Tea Party, right, to protest the Tea Act, which led to then a boycott of British tea, and the idea that we were no longer a tea drinking nation. And so one of my things I love, oh,
Thought I'd pull up some Tea Party stuff.
yeah. Um, and so instead of drinking tea, Americans would drink what they called Liberty tea, which were herbal teas. Raspberry leaf was a very common one. They often like to emphasize that they were using native herbs or native plants for their teas. And this was one way that women, as kind of keepers of the house and in charge of purchasing food and other household goods, could also kind of participate in this revolution.
Yeah. I think it's important to point out also the mode of communication that we're talking about for propaganda during the Revolutionary War and how people were getting their information and word of mouth. Yes, you could sit at a tavern, you can sit at a church and kind of gossip to yourselves about the things that you hear, but it would be most often broadsides, images like this in newspapers. Songs were also a form of propaganda at the time of where you were leaning towards during the war if you were a loyalist or a patriot. I found this Metropolitan Museum of Art had the black and white, and then I kept Googling and I found the colorized version, which I prefer. But a good old tar and feathering should probably be noted as a form of this. Um, it was not a fun time. They would literally put hot tar on you. They would feather you, and then they would drag you through the streets of whatever town that you were in. And if anybody has ever been around a piece of wax that falls on you from a candle, imagine something about 100 million times worse around your entire body. So this was meant to be a very long-term way to show political dissent, often done by Sons of Liberty. You can see the Liberty Tree behind them, the noose, the tar and feathering, and then the force feeding of the tea, and then the tea being pushed into the harbor behind them. It's one of my favorites as a Revolutionary War historian. I always like being able to show this one because it's just an interesting act of dissent and political. I don't know how to describe tar and feathering without using like bad words. It really hurt the person it was affecting. Let's leave it there. They've stopped doing it. I don't know why it never made a comeback.
I wonder why, Mary.
Hmm. Let's see, Stamp Act. Yeah, Stamp Act also nailed to the tree, upside down, no less. It's such a good image for, there's so many things going into it that you can literally just pick a piece of it and dissect it of it. I mean, this was made in 1774, but it really does take you through 1776. I mean, it's just a beautiful piece of propaganda to be used. So this would have been published in the American colonies. There's one where people of Boston are put in a cage, which was printed in the English press at the time. I think that was 73. Do not quote me. And that was being the people of Boston, and they're being fed through a cage. And then you can see in the background in Boston Harbor, all of the ships are coming in as well. So there was propaganda and there was press going in on both sides of the Atlantic. I think that's always important to show that it wasn't just a one-sided opinion of the things that were going on. And even in the colonies at the time, it was very divided. Um, all these years, I still say it was about 50-50, 60-40, depending on the act, depending on who got affected by what. But these are really good. These are really good images. I have one more. Yeah, so sixpence a day from 1775. This one comes from London. This one has a lot of different symbolism and imagery in it. My goodness, the allergies in the springtime have already got to my head. There's a lot of different things going on in here. British soldiers, they led a very difficult life. And then the satirical print were the first months of the war. Um, you can see that they're not doing very well. They're very emaciated. I thought it was important to point out the mother and the children begging for food, for water, for sustenance. The man to the left of what I think is another child is holding ale. There's a lot of stuff going on in this one, which was also really important to show. Um, at his feet, let's see, I wrote down notes. Oh, you can see on the bottom. Can you guys see my mouse at all? Maybe. There's a, it says famine on the side that he's standing on. You can see skull and bones. So you can see that there is famine going on. And I think it's a good way to kind of roll into food being used as political control, as some sort of overarching control by governments, and the power that they had. You can see this a lot during the Revolutionary War, with blacks coming in, harbors being shut down, food being stolen, access to those farmlands being shut down. Also, just burning down farms when they were done with it, and burning down livestock and property and such. You see this during the Civil War. You see this during every major war, because it's a common war tactic, is to just destroy the supplies that you do not need. Because a well-fed belly gives you good thoughts, gives you energy, and gives you the ability to focus on what it is that you're doing. When you take away food, you take away somebody's ability to be the best that they can be. And you see this a lot. I don't understand the proportions in this, but it's okay. It comes with the territory of looking at propaganda. That British soldier is very tall, and that other child is very, very tiny. I digress. I see a bunch of comments about the melting pot, which is very interesting. Chelsea said, I'm a social studies teacher and I show them American rocks as a glimpse into what nationalism was like in the 1970s rather than a way to interpret modern America. Very cool, very different. Melting pot, middle school, early 2000s. Okay, we're getting places. The 70s as well. Did everybody know that the melting pot came from a play? Maybe. Okay, let's go into this one that I figured out. Let's pull this up. All these years, still don't know how to use Zoom. I know. Oops. Here we go. So the concept of a melting pot came from a play by Israel Zangwill in 1908. He was a British writer and he wrote a stage play called The Melting Pot. So the image on the left is from the theater program. It's the cover. It debuted in the United States later in 1909, and it told the story of David Quixano, a fictional Russian Jewish immigrant who is intent on moving to the United States after his family dies in a violent anti-Semitic riot in Russia. In it, a character says, America is God's crucible, the great melting pot where all the races of Europe are melting and reforming. So this comes at a time of major immigration, which we've covered many times here on Taproom Tastings. And kind of all of these people are coming into the United States at different times from 1860 until the early 19, we'll call it 15 is probably when it starts to slow down, 1920, depending on what was going on in Europe at the time. Through the play, he advocates for America as this kind of like great nation. The melting pot was this idea that everybody kind of comes together and it's all homogenous and everything is great. But in 1916, 1909, that's obviously not the case. This concept of we are all Americans once you land is great in theory, but it's not really what was actually being implied and executed here in the United States. During this process, it's expected that like your European or your Asian roots kind of go and play a second string to become this new American citizen and taking on all of these new cultural values and identity and kind of losing the things that you came to the United States with. Your culture, your religion, they are supposed to melt away into the stew, so the melting pot. So you can see the image on the right I thought was very interesting. So it's equal rights. It is the mortar of assimilation of citizenship, except for, then you can make, I mean, it's very timely because we're in March. The guy on the left with the knife is an Irishman, because it took the Irish a very long time. I don't want to say it took them a very long time to assimilate. It took the United States a long time to realize that people were here from Ireland. I think that's what I'm going to go with. But you can see that the process of assimilation in the United States is not easy. We all come with different backgrounds. I'm a first generation Greek American immigrant, and I couldn't imagine not having those pieces of my life with me, of my what my family has given me and what my ancestors have passed down to me. And kind of it leads into this discussion of how do you become an American, and I think it's very much different for everybody. Of what do you have to give up? What do you take on? Where is that role? What do you feel comfortable with? And I think the concept of American is very difficult, and I think it's still, even from 1900, still rings very true today. But I did not realize that the melting pot was a play until I did this. And then I did some more digging, and it turns out in the 1960s, this idea of American pluralism that we're going for comes from the melting pot. We're not a melting pot. Everybody gets to keep their identity, but we all have to be American in some ways. So it becomes a salad. So I was taught at the end of melting pot at the beginning of salad. So I remember at elementary school it being melting pot. But by the time I got into high school, which was the early 2000s, it was salad. And it was like, you can keep everything you want, and nothing has to kind of become this big stew that's all one big piece. And like a salad, you still have all of those individual ingredients that make a beautiful salad together. Um, very strange combo. But yeah, the propaganda behind this, I was not expecting to find something so violently anti-Irish, but here we are. Might be time for an Irish American foodways lecture.
Yeah, I think this idea of melting pot and salad and things like that really tie into, because food is so important to
Mm-hmm.
identity, personal
Mm-hmm.
identity, but also national identity. Um, and that using food and, governments have used food both as a way to kind of exclude people, but also to have you have used food to reach out in diplomacy aspects as well. And I was thinking, you brought up the melting pot imagery from 1916, right? The early 1900s, as we're coming into World War One. And all of the World War One is really the first war where you have like a major effort, and a very clear, effort. The United States had a literal propaganda factory that was churning out propaganda around food, because that was one of the main ways that Americans really were able to participate in the war effort. As we know, it took the Americans quite a while to enter into World War One as a combatant, because of Wilson's policies of isolationism and things like that. But even before America officially entered the war, we were the food relief supplier for Europe, right? And so there was this huge effort to, to have Americans, uh, you know, preserve and conserve food and save food so that there would be food available first for our allies, and then later, once we are sending soldiers overseas, that they have enough food and that they can feeding the troops. One of the things I learned is that the typical daily rations for a U.S. infantryman in World War One was about 5,000 calories a day. And it was made up of a pound of more of meat, 20 ounces of potatoes, and 18 ounces of bread. And this was about 20% more than the French or British armies could supply to their soldiers. So that is a large amount of food. But all of this was really made possible through the efforts of the U.S. Food Administration, which was created in 1917, led by Herbert Hoover, who was dubbed the food dictator. And it was supported by the Committee on Public Information, which was a propaganda factory. That's what it was. But they produced all of these posters that I think a lot of people have seen some of these posters. They kind of float around, um, convincing and encouraging people to not only not waste food, but also, and it seems so kind of modern, some of the terminology they use, like meatless Mondays and wheatless Wednesdays, right? Things that,
Porkless Thursdays.
yeah.
It was like a whole week. Yeah. Oh, there I go. I froze. I'm sorry, everybody. It was interesting to read about the relationship of food during World War One and the propaganda. So I've been showing a few of the ones that I've been able to find. All of these are either on the National Archives or Library of Congress. They've all been beautifully scanned in, and they've all been put into like beautiful finding aids. So they are worth, if you want to spend 20 minutes of your time perusing the internet, I do highly suggest it. They're all incredibly done. So you can see this during World War One, and then we'll go into a little bit of World War Two at the same time. It was interesting to see how the Hooverisms that they called it, of like meatless Monday, meatless Tuesday, porkless Thursday, Saturdays were a fun flex day, from what I can understand. They didn't have anything on Saturdays. But it rethought the way that the American diet was kind of shaped at the time. I found something that was watch your weight anti-Kaiser diet classes for women. So when we say a lot of the propaganda and marketing was for women, it was how do you manage your household? What food are you bringing in? What kind of victory garden are you growing? Um, how are you cooking? What recipe books are you using? And my love of recipe books was the water this time. It was interesting to see how they made all of these things. And I think Catherine has a few recipes to share with us. But it was an indoctrination of how can you intake less to help the war efforts in different ways. And then how do you help the women of France? When we talk about the role of women, it was this poster was specifically made for women to help the war effort to make them think about the women across the ocean. And then there was one when we go back to multiculturalism, the food will win the war was literally the name of the propaganda machine. That's what Hoover called it. And they were printing these in many different languages except for German. German was the only one that did not make it, and there was quite a bit of anti-German sentiment during World War One, which is fine. It's okay. Sauerkraut became Liberty cabbage, and hamburgers became Liberty steaks. Um, and we can make that connection to if we want to jump to the post 9/11 idea of freedom fries, freedom toast, and how to be angry at people who don't support you or that you're mad at through different ways by renaming the foods that are important to them. But it was definitely very women geared. I think it did make a difference. I was interested to find statistics about how successful these were. During the first year of the United States Food Administration's existence, Americans reduced their food consumption by 15%. So 15% of the food production intake went down the first year that we entered World War One, which is wildly impressive, especially when we talk about food waste and recycling and production today. And then food conservation trains were very popular at the time. The U.S. Food Administration had women's chapters kind of thrown throughout the states. So they would have small women volunteer-run organizations kind of go into towns and tell women about how to do canning, how to preserve your food, what cookbooks to eat that were produced by the United States, the government at the time, and a bunch of different things. I think it's adorable that they came with the train and that they went through Pennsylvania. But you can see all of the jarring, all of the spices, all of the canned foods in these images, and it's incredible because it really did such a great job. we haven't been able to reproduce World War I, World War II kind of rallying since in the same exact way.
Yeah, one of the things I learned about this whole food will win the war effort is how much it changed the way Americans eat, but also just other food culture too, right?
Hmm.
It World War One happened around the same time that the field of nutritional science was taking off. And
Hmm.
so they kind of supported each other in that way. You have the nutritional scientists who are kind of looking to gain credibility with the public, who are now being able to say, well, you can make these substitutions and you can, you know, it's actually not great to have so much sugar. So you should take your sugar out and replace it with syrups or things like that. Or corn is better than wheat. And so you should stop eating wheat so that we can send it to the soldiers, things like that. And you have uh, a big effort in home economics classes, right? That Mary was talking about, teaching women how to can, how to grow gardens, things like that. But also, it was about the same time, and this was kind of because of World War One, that grocery stores went from being full service to being self-service.
Hmm.
The first self-service grocery store was Piggly Wiggly. And it's when, so now the consumer is going through and picking the things that they want. And rather than having to ask a somebody at the counter to go and get the the produce or the goods that they want. And this actually allowed stores to supply consumers with a larger variety of products, which helped with the whole idea of substitutions, right? Because if your store, your general store, your grocery store just doesn't have the variety to make those substitutions, then you can't really participate in this campaign the same way. And so, yeah, the self-service grocery store kind of kicked off because of this, which I think was fascinating. I didn't realize that.
We take it for granted, don't we? So we can just go in and do what we want and kind of pick up what we like
Yeah.
and kind of go home. I mean, honestly, I don't know if the early 19th century would be able to handle the concept of like a Costco or a BJ's wholesaler. Um, it blow their mind. I mean, it freaks me out that I can buy a 10-pound bag of oatmeal for $10. Yeah, I digress. That's a different concept. The supermarket should be its own topic, I think. Um, but yeah, the volume of food that was being produced through the Victory Gardens, I thought was quite amazing. I was able to find more statistics on that because I was like, you always want to go, you see these propagandas, you see these advertisements, how successful were they? So in 1939, more than $200 million worth of vegetables were grown in nearly 5 million home gardens, which is insane. By 1944, 18.5 million gardeners took part in Victory Gardens, including Mickey Mouse, Eleanor Roosevelt, and the vice president at the time, Henry Wallace. I was unable to find Mickey Mouse's, so I would wonder that they were some on Disney World or like Disney World was helping lead propaganda for that, but I was unable to find any. But I would imagine I'll find it tomorrow after all of this is done and I'm not looking so hard. But there was definitely an increase in the volume of Victory Gardens from World War I into World War II, and the amount of food that was being produced. Before I forget, I do want to show this incredible news article from the Brooklyn Daily Eagle about the Lott farm producing food during World War I. It is very cool. It says it's Andrew H. Saddam, and it was a record farming season at the Lott House at 16,000 bushels of potatoes. You can see the farm here in these images that I pulled from the newspaper article. You can see the house in the middle photo. The house is slightly in that back right corner. My little farmhouse is right there. And then what makes this more incredible is even by 1916, when they were still farming, the farm was it was still under 70 acres. So it wasn't nearly as large as the 300 acres that we had known like the century before or even 50 years earlier. So the fact that they were still pushing out this amount of, it was corn, it was cabbage, it was potatoes. You can see the string beans and the bean pickers in the middle. All of those buckets, by the way, are in our collection. I'm in the process of cataloging them. They are amazing. It's so cool to be able to have photographs of these objects. The perks of not being a Revolutionary War historian anymore, I guess, moving into a farm life for me. But I thought it was really cool that I was able to show what they were doing in Brooklyn and in Flatlands at the time because it was still such an agricultural area. All of these farms were still pushing out food for the soldiers, um, and having their very large scale victory garden at this point in time. But it is pretty cool. And I was able to find, I'm going to jump ahead, their ration cards from World War II. So you can see these are from Cornelia Lott, John's daughter, from her house down the road on Quentin, 4021 Quentin Road. So we have a set of some of their ration books, which is pretty cool, of what they've used, what they didn't use, um, and what was available to them in Brooklyn at the time, which is pretty cool. It's a whole new world for me. I found all of these wildly interesting. So I was very excited to be able to pull them up. I still think having photographs with the family is like mind blowing. But such is life. But I thought those were really cool. And I was like, oh, I actually have a connection this time. It's not just like vague concepts of the Lott House. I'll have actual things. But it was very cool. So I hope everybody also appreciates these because I was very excited. Where did I find the ration cards? That's a great question. So in the process of cataloging the collection, we still have Lott descendants who are sending us things that lived in the house that were part of their grandparents or aunts and uncles. The ration cards came from, I want to say, Catherine Lott, whose father who grew up in the house. Um, and she's been so generous with sending us things. We recently just got some plateware, I want to say, is in a box that I'm in the process of going through. And everything is just so beautiful. One of our newer pieces is one of the original stoves that was in the house. So we'll be putting that back into the house for interpretive purposes when we open in a couple of years, which is really, really exciting. We have, I mean, the beauty about the Lotts is that they love to document themselves. So when you're looking back, I have something from almost every generation of the 8 that lived in this house. I can point to something. So it's really nice to be able to like point to an era and say, we have photos. They were in the newspaper and I can show you all of the bushels. So it's really exciting. Uh, I'll have to pull up some more farming photos as we start doing like 20th century stuff, which is very exciting. But yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately, the Keeler Tavern doesn't have a whole lot related to this topic, but I guess the only thing is we do know, we talked about boycotts during the American Revolution, and we do have that I bring up frequently is Timothy Keeler's ledgers. And we believe that he did participate in these boycotts because he does not have any ledger entries from 1775 to 1784, which is the duration of the war. So unless he had like a secret ledger somewhere, that we believe that he did participate in these boycotts that were mostly around food, although they included other things as well. I know, Mary, you brought it up, so I wanted to show these folks. So beginning in 1918, we start to see, and actually before, politically motivated renamings of things. And so with all the anti-German sentiment that was taking place around World War I, you have things like sauerkraut being called Liberty cabbage. Hamburgers were Liberty steaks or Liberty sandwiches. And throughout the years, you see different things. I pulled a couple of other, and it wasn't just food. They also renamed a lot of towns or streets were renamed during this time. And also dog breeds were renamed. In England, the German Shepherd was called the Alsatian. Um, and then in 2003, we had the famous, infamous freedom fries instead of French fries because the French were not supportive of our invasion of Iraq. And what else did we have? French toast was freedom toast. And then this one I saw literally a few days ago. And this is in Canada, protesting the tariffs that the president has been applying. And so the Americano is now called the Canadiano. This is not the first time the Americano has been renamed by various people. Apparently in Russia, about in 2016, Dmitry Medvedev declared that the Americano is now called the Russiano. So that seems to be a very common one. Is I guess coffee is now so ubiquitous, and the Americano is there.
This
So
rhymes.
it does rhyme.
It just
So
rhymes so well.
yeah, so that's the latest kind of politically motivated renaming. The thing about these renamings is they don't seem to stick very well. As soon as World War I's over, there's no more Liberty cabbage. It's sauerkraut again. We still call them hamburgers. We don't call
Oh,
them freedom
goodness.
fries anymore. The interesting thing about French fries, I did learn, is one of the stories about why they're called French fries is because the World War I soldiers who were stationed in Belgium, actually, discovered the French fried cuts, right? In Belgium, they were producing these stick-shaped fried potatoes, as opposed to potato rounds. And so it's the American soldiers from World War I who are coming back and bringing these French fries. They were considered French because that's the language that was spoken in Belgium at the time. So then we turn around and rename them freedom fries.
Mhm. So everybody's wrong, and we're just eating fried potatoes, and we've all just kept renaming them different ways depending on
Yeah,
the way of the wind.
the way of the wind.
Great, incredible. Leave the potatoes out of how dare you? They're amazing, they're incredible. I want to share my fun carrot one though. This one I've been holding on to. Uh let me get the slide up because it'll make more sense when I start talking about Nazis. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Carrot. So I'm sure, along with the melting pot concept, we've all heard that carrots give you really good eyesight and that you should eat 100 of them so that you can see in the middle of the night. We all know that's like propaganda, right? I'm assuming with everybody's cameras off, they're like, oh my God, what do you mean, Mary? Tell me more. This was one of my favorite things to debunk and tell people. Eating carrots, eyesight, and Nazis. Three things that obviously are going to make sense. During World War II specifically, so you can see the two advertisements here about how deep this went. The British government, the Office of Information, MOI, launched this propaganda about their pilots eating an enormous amount of carrots to be able to fulfill night raids, to shoot down German helicopters and planes successfully because they had just created the technology of interception radar and they didn't want anybody to know their secrets. So they ran these campaigns about carrots so heavily that they were creating Dr. Carrot to have British children eat carrots to the point where Nazi soldiers were now including carrots in their diets during World War II. Carrots are a great source of beta carotene, FYI. They're delicious. They go great with ranch and tzatziki sauce, but they will not let you see in the dark. But it didn't matter in the 1940s because if everybody believed it and everybody was eating copious amount of carrots, which were also being grown on the Lott property, we were helping the war effort. I can't imagine the conversations of German soldiers sitting at a lunch table looking at carrots going, this is going to make me see in the dark. It's a vegetable. It grew in the ground. I'm confused. And the British propaganda machine just like pushing it out for kids because I've seen there were images of in England and in like supermarket areas, market areas. It was just signs for like a bushel of carrots for $1, specifically for children to eat. Like it was a child's price, like a McDonald's child's menu. But also, can we talk about how terrifying Dr. Carrot is? He looks like the Monopoly man, but like with a bigger head. Um,
Kelsey makes a really good point.
I,
Why is Dr. Carrot wearing glasses if his eyesight's
you
supposed to
know,
be so good?
Chelsea, that's a great question. I don't even know who to submit that question to at this point in time. They like really just committed to the bit. And even on the left, like eat your carrots and leafy greens so you can see in the night, so you don't need night vision goggles. Um, I, Mr. Carrot, I was very excited to share this. Poor Catherine had to hear about this for like 2 days. Um, I terrified of this man. My 6-year-old daughter was like, that doesn't make me want to eat carrots. So there's a difference in the children from 1940s who are willing to support the war and my 6-year-old who doesn't also eat pizza. Um, but yeah, I really wanted to share Dr. Carrot and the Lott family stuff. So if anybody has ever like seen any other advertisements, please share them my way. Please email me because the eyebrows, the glasses, the pose, what propaganda? I would eat carrots. Like I would listen, to be clear with everybody, I'll fall for any kind of propaganda. I am the ultimate consumer when it comes to this kind of stuff and be like, it looks cute. Let me try it. Wouldn't even think anything of it because I was like, I have glasses. Maybe they'll get rid of my glasses. I'm done with my rant. I get one a month. Sorry. I don't even know where to pick up from there.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I don't want to like bring the mood down, but I was just thinking, we've been talking about a lot about how the governments have been using propaganda and food in propaganda to really okay, the carrot presentation. But you know, how governments are using the propaganda in kind of official ways, right? But one of the things that, Mary, I know you and I both looked at is how other groups were using food for activism purposes and how food was being used not just as a tool, it could be used as a weapon, right, in controlling access to food and especially during the civil rights movement and in the South, especially where they're trying to maintain this really incredible the segregation. You often see communities using food access as a weapon against Black citizens to try and maintain the segregation that's happening. So in one of the ones that I learned about that I think was the most widely publicized was the Greenwood food blockade in 1962, where this is in the Mississippi Delta and where you have a lot of Black Mississippians who are sharecroppers, and they relied very heavily on government provided food, especially during the winter outside of the growing season. And the local county actually in 1962 in sort of retribution for uh, activism that was happening in the area, they actually just ended their participation in the federal surplus food commodity program, which benefited these Black sharecroppers. Um, but on the other side, you have a lot of these civil rights groups who were using food as a way to organize and a way to support the movement and things like that. So I know, Mary, you had some.
Ooh, I came with posters today. The two groups that I think we kind of honed in on were the Black Panthers, and I have one on the Young Lords here that we can talk about in just a second. But specifically, their free breakfast programs that were targeted for children at the time, with uh, food scarcity and this concept of, pull up my notes, um, the concept of food scarcity, uh, racist uh, legislation, Jim Crow era-esque situations that we're getting out of still early in the 1960s, 1970s, where those effects are still being felt in poor and underserved neighborhoods all over the country. So the Black Panthers had chapters all over the United States. These posters are from the Detroit, Michigan area in the 1970s. So free breakfast for the youth. They understood that if you serve children hot breakfast at school, they are going to attend school. They are going to get a hot meal guaranteed, and they are more likely to be focused and ready for school to learn. This still rings true today. The free breakfast programs that they start pushing here through the Black Panthers and the Young Lords, the Puerto Rican group in New York City at the time, help push through that the free breakfast programs that we have today in the United States that are all unfortunately relatively new in terms of like we should have always been doing this. I don't understand, and maybe it's divisive, but why don't you want children to have full bellies? It should fall on everybody's political spectrum of like that's a good thing to do. But it is really interesting to see how they unionized and how they not unionized, but how they organized themselves because of their mutual aid network. It was they were getting food from local victory gardens that were still continuing from the neighborhoods. They were getting food and money from prominent doctors, nurses, lawyers. People were chipping in any way that they could. So they were getting nutritious meals. It wasn't very high sugary, wasn't, they were nutritionally dense meals, which I think is very important to say of like, you can get a free breakfast, but you're getting a full, you're getting your eggs, you're getting your protein, you're getting your carbohydrates. You are really setting these children up for success for the day. And they were really beautiful programs. I can show you, these are the advertisements that came from the Young Lords Party. So all of these groups at the time are coming out with things that should be accessible for people. So health, food, housing, education. The Black Panthers had a 10 or 12 point program. The 10-point program, which was their guidelines, and point 10 specifically was we want bread, we want land, we want bread, housing, education, clothing, justice, and peace. Which is, I think, something everybody. So it was interesting to see these movements shift in, and the federal government starts taking attention. These groups are not seen as very politically positive over the next couple of years because of their initiatives. But the roots of these organizations truly was to make the neighborhoods that they were living in that were underserved by the federal government better places to live for the next generations to set them up for success. And I think that's very important to point out, regardless of future talk about them. I'm trying to stay as nice as I can about these topics. But it is nice to see that their posters have been preserved. So these are in the Smithsonian National Museum, which is very interesting. It's interesting to show the poster on the left here from 1972. I found at an auction website that sold for about $1,500.
Wow.
Uh-huh. I did not think that would be the case, but it was very expensive, and I thought that was pretty cool. But there are the concepts of control and the government and how we access food and the propaganda that plays into it and how we reach our constituency and our community through mutual aid in many different ways. Um, Food is a symbol, but also can be used as a weapon. I know I was talking about how people love using tomatoes and eggs as a literal form of protest. Tomatoes are great; they're squishy. They make a good splat noise. Canned tomatoes are better for a form of protest. Uh, but I know we were touching upon this earlier of the usage of food in climate protest as well today as part of their propaganda. And I know Catherine brought up it's the Just Stop Oil movement. That's the one that's kind of been getting a lot of attention over the last couple of years over in the UK. I don't have any images of them,
Yeah,
but
they're the ones who have been throwing canned soup at like the Mona Lisa and the works of art of work, around the world. They're a British group that are protesting high energy prices and climate change. And to kind of bring it back to the where we started about food being kind of bigger than just food, right? It's emblematic of economic and social um the economic and social and political environment we're in. One of the reasons Just Stop Oil says that they use canned soup is to also make commentary on the cost of living crisis, right? With energy prices so high, with food prices so high, somebody can maybe afford the can of soup, but they can't afford the fuel to then heat it up, or vice versa. And so it's just building on a very long history of using food not only as a way of an official way of control, but also a way of method of protest, right? Either as a physical weapon or through kind of broader things like that.
when in doubt, just throw the food.
Yeah, when in doubt, throw the
I,
food. Yeah. Um,
I did learn the last one I do want to point out, which I did not know, is milkshakes. Um, People are throwing milkshakes as a form of protest. It's a anti-fascist movement, left-wing protest tactic, where they make milkshakes, but they also include quick-drying cement in them, and they are throwing them at politicians. And I want to say it was Portland. There was a Proud Boys
thing.
uh, some Proud Boys gathering. Um, and they threw milkshakes at them. And I was like, okay, all right. So yeah, food can be a literal symbol for protest, and it should be an actual form of protest as well.
Yeah. And there's always
What a
there's
great conversation.
there's the classic pieing, pie to the face. That's always a good
Oh, yeah, I wouldn't waste pie though.
one.
Go back to the Taproom Tastings episode about pie, and you'll see how deeply I feel about pie. I wouldn't waste that. A tomato, yeah, for sure. Maybe not an egg right now, but not a pie. Sorry,
All right.
everybody.
So I think we'll end it there with throwing food. Thank you all for joining us. I hope you enjoyed tonight's presentation. I hope you learned a little bit tonight. That's always our goal, is that you walk away having learned just a little bit of something. And I hope you'll join us again next month. I should have checked the date before.
April 8th. April 8th.
April 8th, we will be talking about the history of wine.
So everybody must come with a glass of wine.
Yeah, yes. And yeah, enjoy. Hopefully the weather stays pretty nice now, and that winter is finally on its way out here in the Northeast. So enjoy the rest of your evening, and we'll see you next month.